The Duelist has entered the fray as the newest hero in the Darkest Dungeon 2 roster, and damn does she bring a lot to the table. In this video, I'm going to be covering her abilities and paths, as well as trinkets, and going over some of her strengths and weaknesses. Finally, I'll end us off with a few ways that I found best to play her. So first of all, let's talk about the Duelist overall. She is an extremely rank-flexible hero, with some of the most complex and intricate playstyles that we've ever seen in this game. Her dual stance combat system means that almost every one of her abilities has multiple effects, allowing the player to swap up the playbook easily depending on the needs of the team at that moment. She's easily one of the hardest heroes to learn, but one of the most fun to master. So, let's take a look into her kit in a bit more detail. Okay, so let's go through the abilities for the Duelist, Sahar. So it does take a minute to go through these abilities, so buckle in here. The first thing that I do want to note is that Sahar has two different stances, and these stances can affect each of her abilities. Almost all of her abilities do have a stance effect, and so it does take some time to get to kind of understand how all these abilities work. They almost have two functions, especially when they are upgraded. Some of them only have one stance effect when unupgraded, and then they get changed to having a different effect on each of her stances. She has both a defensive and an aggressive stance, which are indicated by a special token below her, and they definitely have a lot of effect on the way that you play her. These tokens also have their own effects on her based on her path. So we'll cover those in her path section and just go into detail about what those different stances do. But for now, we're just going to cover her abilities and go through all of their effects. The first ability that we have is Touche. So this ability can be used from any rank, but it can only hit the front two ranks. It makes it a very flexible rank. When unupgraded, it deals a pretty good amount of damage and will actually move her back when she's in defensive stance, and will move her forward when she's in aggressive stance. That does mean if she has no stance, which she generally starts off with no stance unless you have a trinket that gives her a stance to start with, then she will not move forward or back. When upgraded, basically the difference here is that it does more damage, and it will actually allow her to use this ability to gain a stance. So if you're in the front two ranks, it will give her the defensive stance, and if you're in the back two ranks, it will give her the aggressive stance. So this can be used as a way to deal some damage and also prime the stances for her. The next ability we have is Feint. This can be used from the front three ranks and can be used against the front two ranks. Again, all these are in Wanderer. We will talk about her path changes and to those abilities later on. The thing this does deals a little bit of damage here. The main thing is that it will invert her stance. So if she is in the aggressive stance, it will move her into defensive and vice versa. If she has no stance, it will not do that. It won't give her a stance, so do keep that in mind. And it does give her 2 riposte tokens, and when upgraded, it will give her 3 riposte tokens. Our next ability is Disengage. Again, can be used from the front 3 ranks against the back or the front 3 ranks of the enemy group. It deals a decent amount of damage, and it actually ignores riposte, which is a pretty unique thing there. So here you can see that this will actually give her a defensive stance and will also give her dodge. So this is one of the ways you can prime her stances. It will move her back 1, and it has the additional effect of when she has defensive stance and she uses this, it will pull one of the enemies, and when she has the aggressive stance, it will knock back one of the enemies. Now, if she's in aggressive stance and uses this, it will swap her to her defensive stance. That is the first line there, so it will always put her back into defensive, but if you happen to be aggressive, you do get that knockback effect. When upgraded, it does the same things, except that it will give her dodge plus, and it will move the target 2 forward or 2 back, depending on the stance. The next ability that we can see here is Flick. So this damage attack can be used from the front 2 ranks against the front 2 ranks, and basically this is a great way to ignore defensive tokens. So if she is in defensive stance, it will ignore dodge, that includes dodge plus, and if she is in aggressive stance, it will ignore block, and that again ignores block plus. So pretty good there if you're looking to get through an enemy's defense. That being said, when upgraded, it does do a bit more damage, higher crit chance, and it also gains the execution mechanic as well, execution 1. Her next ability is one of her self-support abilities, and that is Preparation. So this is again is a good ability to help her prime one of her stances. It can be used from any rank. It gives her an aggressive stance, a strength token, and a speed token when non-upgraded. When upgraded, it gives her the same things, but it also gives her a buff of plus 50% damage to her riposte abilities for 4 turns if she is in defensive stance, and if she is in aggressive stance, it will give her a crit token. Her next ability is the Boot, which is a brilliant name for an ability. This can be used from the front 3 ranks against the front 2 ranks of enemies. This does require that she is in a stance, so we are getting to the abilities here that do require a stance in order to work. She has to be in aggressive stance for this one to operate. This will knock back the enemy by 2. And when upgraded, it will also give them a combo token while knocking them back 3. So we have a much more potent knockback, one of the few abilities in the game that can do a reliable knockback, especially this distance. So pretty cool. Now we have another one of her abilities that requires a stance. This is a support ability that can be used from any rank for any rank. It requires that she has an aggressive stance. It has a very long cooldown of 5, and it does have a limited battle usage of 2 cooldown. This will give herself, it will remove all of her stance tokens, so this will put her back to having 0 stance, and on the target that you use it against, it will clear all of their skill cooldowns. So if they have something that you're trying to line up, like say a finale on a jester or something like that, you can use this to remove the cooldown and then activate that ability on their turn. Now when upgraded, she can use this ability from either defensive or aggressive stance. It will remove all stance tokens, but only a 50% chance to do so you still have half a chance to keep the tokens. And again, it will go ahead and clear all cooldowns on the hero that you choose to use it on. This next ability is Fleisch. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I may be butchering that one. This can be used from the back 3 ranks against the front 3 ranks of enemies. It deals a good amount of damage, and it deals an additional 30% damage when she has the aggressive stance. This ability will also give her the aggressive stance. It does pay to note here that if she doesn't have the stance before she uses the ability, she won't get the buff from it giving her the stance. The stance comes at the end of the ability. It does move her forward 3, so this puts her back up front, pretty cool, and it removes all dodge from her. When upgraded, it will go ahead and give her more damage, higher crit. It also gives her the additional benefit of increasing her crit if she does have the aggressor stance on. Again, it will give her the aggressor stance, it will move her forward 3, and it will remove all dodge only when she is not in defensive stance. So she uses this ability when she's in defensive stance, she gets to keep her dodge. Next, we have the Meditation ability. Again, this is one of her self-buff abilities. This essentially gives her the defensive stance. It will also give her 3 dodge. If she uses it when she's already in defensive stance, she will get 2 taunt. If she uses it when she's in the aggressive stance, it will give her 2 riposte. When upgraded, this will go ahead and give her 3 dodge plus. It will also remove a combo token, and it has the same modifiers for taunt and riposte on her defensive and aggressive stances. Next, we have Coup de Grace, which is a very interesting ability and is a ranged ability on her. Yep, she's hiding a gun under that cloak. So this is an ability that can be used from any rank against any rank, making it a very potent ability. Now, this has a unique thing in that it doesn't have a damage range. This has a guaranteed amount of damage. So in this case, you can see that it is 4 damage when unupgraded. Has a fairly low crit chance. It does require that she is in the defensive stance, but it ignores both block and weakness. So the weakness is on her and not on the enemy, meaning that it is still a guaranteed amount of damage, and it has an execution 1. When upgraded, it does 6 damage. It has double the crit chance. Again, requires that she is in the defensive stance, ignores block and weakness, but this has execution 2. So essentially, this is a finisher move for an enemy that is on low health but has multiple death armor tokens. You can use this with great effect to remove them from the game very quickly. And finally, we have the Ruthless Instruction ability. So Ruthless Instruction is a buff ability that she can use from any rank on any rank of heroes. It requires that she is in the defensive stance, and it will give the target 2 dodge. When upgraded, it requires that she is in either stance, but she does have to be in a stance. And what it will do is that if she's in defensive, the target gets 2 block. And if she is in aggressive stance, the target gets a buff that allows him to ignore blind for the following 3 turns. So I think there's maybe some interesting plays here for the leper. And that covers all of her abilities on Wanderer. We're going to go ahead and talk about her abilities on her paths next, which is definitely going to change up some of them. So let's talk about that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get into the paths here. Again, these paths are quite different and a bit difficult to understand, so try to keep it in mind that they are a bit complicated. That is part of this class's abilities. So we're going to go ahead and get into things here. So first, we do have the Wanderer path. Her stance passives are survivability via riposte. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the passes on her special tokens, her defensive and aggressive stances. Each of her paths has something like this, and on her Wanderer path, she does have one that differs from the rest of them, and that is that on riposte, in her aggressive stance, she will actually go ahead and heal herself for 10%. There's a 33% chance that happens. And then in her defensive stance on riposte, she has a 33% chance to gain a dodge token, giving her some more potency to her riposte abilities. And that's going to go ahead and cover what her different stances do on the Wanderer path. Now, next we have the Instructrice path. Again, I think I might be butchering a lot of these names. I apologize if I am. So this is I guess kind of a support path that she has. It is a back row taskmaster capable of driving allies forward, whatever the cost. So let's go ahead and take a look at the abilities that this modifies, and then we'll go ahead and cover how her stance tokens change on this path. So the 4 abilities that this modifies are Disengage, again, Coup de Grace, and Ruthless Instruction. So let's take a look at those. So on Disengage, you'll see here that this now moves her back to inverts her stance and gives her dodge. And then on Upgraded, it will move her back to invert her stance and give her dodge plus. The next ability is Again. So let's take a look at this one. It requires that she has her aggressive path. And what this does is it, unupgraded, will give the target plus 10% damage per stress pip for 4 turns. So if they have 5 stress, it'll give them plus 50% damage for the following 4 turns. And then when upgraded, she can use it on either defensive or aggressive stance. And what this will do is actually give 3 stress to the target in defensive stance, but they get an extra turn next round. It is important to note that an extra turn is different than an extra action, which doesn't apply dots or health over time or affect cooldowns or any of those things. It is a true extra turn. So if they have a dot, they will get the dot twice that round, but they can actually lower the cooldown on their ability by 1 instead of what an extra action does. So interesting to keep in mind there. And then they also have, on aggressive stance, this will now give the plus 10% damage per stress pip. So different things there depending on what you're looking for. The next ability that we have is the Coup de Grace. So Coup de Grace on this one actually does have a range of damage, and it has the execution of 1. It does not have the ignore block and the ignore weakness, but it does have a much higher crit chance of 15% base. So that's kind of the difference here. And when upgraded, again, it also has a higher crit chance, more damage, again, being a damage range, but it gets the additional modifier of on a killing blow, it will clear skill cooldowns on her. So consider the fact some of her abilities do have quite long cooldowns, like again, has a cooldown of 3 here. It can definitely be used to your advantage. And the final one here is Ruthless Instruction. So this one requires that she has the defensive or aggressive stance on the target. If she has the defensive stance, it'll actually reduce stress by 2, so you can use this as a stress heal. And if they have the aggressive stance, it will give them 1 stress and a strength token. And then on upgraded, if she has the defensive stance, she will actually reduce their stress by 3 and remove horror, which basically makes this the same as the Jester's ability to remove stress, Inspiring Tune, but she can't use it on herself. So interesting ability there. And then when upgraded, it will give them plus 2 stress, but will give them a crit token when she is in the aggressor stance. So you can get some crit there, but a little bit of stress. Interesting stuff. And then next for the Instructrice path, we're going to go ahead and cover what her passives are on both of her stances. On her aggressive stance, if you have a killing blow, you gain 3 regen, which is pretty interesting. And then on her defensive stance, on a killing blow, you actually reduce her stress by 1. Okay, so that's covered the Instructrice path. Next, we're going to go ahead and cover the Antagonist path that she has. So this one is described as skilled at disrupting the enemy, creating openings for allies to exploit. We'll go ahead and cover what the stance passives are on this path later, but let's go ahead and take a look at the abilities that it modifies. So the first one is Touche. So on this one, when she uses Touche, the target will get weakness if she is in defensive stance and vulnerable if she is in aggressive stance. This is a good way for her to help in applying some tokens for your other teammates to take advantage of. And then when upgraded, this will give her again the modifier of allowing her to gain a stance token if she doesn't already have one, and then also again give the weakness and vulnerable tokens. So pretty interesting stuff there. The next one that we have is Disengage. So on this one, again, it ignores riposte. I believe that is common across most of her, if not all of her paths. This will move her back 1, give her the defensive stance and a dodge token, and will also mark the target with a combo mark when she has the aggressive stance. And then when upgraded, if she has the defensive stance, she will actually give the target ×2 blind if they are comboed, and it will combo the target if she has the aggressive stance. A lot of things to take in here. Definitely takes a second, right? The next one that we have is the boot. So here is the boot on the Antagonist path. So this requires, again, that she is in the defensive stance. It'll knock back the target 2 and actually stun the target when she has a combo on that target. So very interesting there. And then when upgraded, she can use it on either her defensive or aggressive stance. If the target is comboed, she will go ahead and stun them in the defensive stance. And when she's in the aggressive stance, it will give the target combo. And then finally, we have Coup de Grace. So you'll see here that it has much lower damage. It does require that she is in the aggressive stance, and it has a cooldown of 2. It will remove stance tokens from her, but it will give 2 weakness and 2 vulnerable to the enemy when used. So again, this is less about doing any execution and more about weakening the enemy. That is pretty potent. When upgraded, she can use it on either stance, but if she is in defensive stance, it will stun on base, no combo required, making it one of the most potent stuns in the game. And then when she is in the aggressive stance, again, it will give the ×2 weakness and ×2 vulnerable. So a pretty interesting ability there. And that's going to be all of her abilities on the Antagonist path. Let's go ahead and talk about her passives on her stances right now. Okay, so here are the stance effects for her Antagonist path. The first one is her aggressive stance, and so her skills gain an additional 20% debuff resist piercing when she's in aggressive stance. In her defensive stance, though, her sword skills actually give a -5 debuff resist to the enemy. So it actually applies a debuff resist piercing to them, allowing you to actually be able to apply debuffs to them easier. All right, so that covers the stance passives there. Let's go ahead into her last path, and this is the Intrepid path. Again, I hope I'm not butchering these too much. This is a rank flexible, extremely high risk role with a high damage potential. So her stance passives here are pretty interesting. We're gonna go ahead and talk about these at the end of this, but do keep in mind that this is kind of a glass cannon role, and you'll understand why when we talk about her stance passives. But let's take a look at how this affects her different abilities. So the first one we have is Feint. So this one will actually invert stance and give dodge instead of giving riposte, which is pretty important for her. And then upgraded, it will give the dodge plus. Then we have Disengage. This again ignores riposte. When moving, it'll move her back and give her stealth when she is in defensive stance. So that's pretty interesting. When upgraded, again, it will give her stealth when moving back on defensive stance, but it will also give her guard 2 from an ally behind her when she has the aggressive stance, so she can self-guard herself. Again, pretty interesting. This does make sense when we look at her stance passives. The next one that we have is Preparation. So taking a look at Preparation here, this will give her the aggressive stance, will also give her strength and speed, but when upgraded, it will remove all dots from her when she is in the defensive stance, and will give her a crit token if she uses it while she's already in aggressive stance. And then the last one is coup de grace. So you can see here, again, this has the ranged damage, usable from any rank to any rank. It does have a cooldown of 2, but it will remove the intrepid stance effects. So this is a good way to clear those stance effects if they have stacked up too high against you, and you'll see again why these are important in a second. And when upgraded, I believe all it does is just increase the damage on this and increase the crit chance, and again removes the intrepid stance effects. So it's kind of a clear all. So let's go ahead and take a look at why these stance effects are so important on this path. All right, so next we're going to talk about her stance passives on the intrepid path. And so the first one is her aggressive stance. And this one, again, is interesting in that it stacks up to 5 times until she is hit. So every time she misses an attack, right, she will gain one of these. She'll gain a buff and a debuff. She gets both of these at the same time. It stacks up to 5 times. And then when she's hit, she then removes that stack. So in the aggressive stance, when missed, she will gain an additional 5% crit, but a minus 10% debuff to all of her dot resistances. And then this is the real glass cannon effect here. When missed, she will gain an additional 20% damage dealt, again stacking up to 5 times, but then she will also gain plus 40% damage received, stacking up to 4 times, meaning she can pretty much get one hit by almost anything. And yeah, so that's going to go ahead and cover all of Sahar's paths. She is a very complicated hero when it comes to paths. I know this is a lot of information to take in. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. All right, and so next we're going to go ahead and cover the trinkets for the Duelist. Like every hero, there are 3 of them available. So we're going to go ahead with the first one here, which is the Academy Ring. I don't really know how to pronounce that, but it is a trinket that gives her riposte skills an additional 10% crit chance, and they already hit pretty hard. It also gives her an additional 33% move resist piercing, so she has a few abilities that can knock people around, so this allows you to do that more effectively, making her very good at disruption. And it does have the downside that if she misses, she has a chance to remove one of her dodge tokens, so you definitely want to make sure that she doesn't have one of those nasty blind tokens on her. The next trinket we have here is the Dark Lantern trinket, and yes, I looked it up, that is how you pronounce that, weirdly enough. So on combat start, this trinket will start the Duelist in her defensive stance, meaning you do not need to prep a stance for her. Also, apply on hit, riposte skills will potentially give a 66% chance to give a blind token. The downside to this trinket is that when she is hit, she has a 15% chance to have a burn applied to her, so do keep that in mind. Finally, we have the Lover's Glove trinket. So this one, like the Lantern trinket, starts her off in a stance, but it starts her in her aggressive stance. Her again skills will also give the target a speed token, letting them set up for a potent attack. And the downside to this trinket is that if she misses, she has a 25% chance to gain a stress pip. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about with Sahar is going to be her strengths, of which she does have many, even though she is very complicated. That is also where her strengths come into play. She has one of the, if not probably the most flexible playstyle available to you as a hero in this game, due to the fact that she does have these multitude of different stances and paths. I think out of all the heroes, her paths, and even her Wanderer path, are all very dynamically different, to the point where you can play her in extremely different ways very easily. And even within the same path, you can play her in multiple different ways because of her multitude of stances and the way that they affect abilities, right? I mean, you look at the Instructrice path, for instance, and you can either make her a stress healer if you're in defensive, or you can give stress but increase damage if you're in aggressive, right? So there's just many different ways that you can play her, and that's where her strength comes in. She has a multitude of abilities that can be used from almost any rank, making her extremely flexible. This means that she can fit into almost every single team that you could possibly imagine. She does a lot of damage, raw damage, right? So she is pretty good at just like one-shotting enemies. She has a lot of burst damage, and she has a lot of execution potential with her coup de grace on most of her paths, excluding her intrepid path, of course. She does have the ability to just kind of take out enemies there, or at least line up enemies for being killed by other heroes very easily, and she even has a lot of benefits for doing things like killing enemies. And then again, she also has a lot of damage on her riposte. Now, riposte isn't just kind of an additional bit of damage for her, it's almost one of her mainstays of damage, because her riposte is actually so heavy hitting. Even compared to the man-at-arms and the highwaymen, you can actually use it as a more reliable form of damage with her, and I found that I've actually found most of my kills coming from her riposte in a lot of cases, or at least a lot of the raw damage that I get out of her. It's kind of how I compensate for her not having any damage over time, is by using her riposte abilities to kind of get that additional damage in between turns. The other thing she's very good at is just helping out your team, whether that's applying debuffs on her paths or even just removing the cooldowns on your teammates to allow them to set up for their most potent abilities very, very quickly. It does take a bit more effort than something like Encore, but like Encore doesn't remove the cooldown on an ability, whereas her Again ability on the Instructrice path does remove that cooldown, so actually allows that character to reduce the cooldown on something and then be able to use it again. There's a lot of potency when it comes to the ability to do something like that, so you can definitely use her as a great setup hero. And I think really that's what her strengths lie in. There's so many ways that you can play her. I mean, I've had my hands on her for quite some hours, and I can't even say that I've scratched the surface with the multitude of play styles that she has. It really just means that you can put her in so many different teams that I can't even imagine all the different combinations of effects and abilities and things that you could do to create some of the most wonky teams ever. I mean, especially looking at her, like her Intrepid path, her glass cannon path, some of the damage you can get out of that ability, the stacking of that plus 20% damage and the crit chance, I mean, you can just get some gnarly damage if you're willing to risk her potentially being hit down the death's door in one hit. So very, very cool stuff there. But with the strengths, of course, come the weaknesses, and I think what her greatest strength is, her complexity and her layered abilities, is also her greatest weakness. She is a complex hero. I mean, even recording this video, it really just gave me an idea of how complex all of her abilities are, and not to mention that multiple of her abilities change quite dramatically in all of her paths, and then they have a different ability if it's defensive or aggressive. She has a lot of movement abilities that can sometimes kind of get like you a bit confused, like, oh god, okay, so now she's moved back, but she can't use that ability from this rank, so now I have to find a way to move her forward. It also requires you to think about how you're going to get the stance that you want. How are you going to prime her into aggressive stance? And if she's in defensive, like, what are you going to use to switch? And if you're switching, does it make it difficult to, are you better off just trying to do the damage, or should you switch to do a better ability, or to get the stress heal, or to get the buff, or whatever the case is? There's a lot of nuance when it comes to this character. And that, I think, is going to be a big turnoff for a lot of people. I think for most people, like myself, they're really going to enjoy that challenge. But I know that this is probably her biggest weakness. It's just hard to get her to do. You can look at it on paper and be like, I want her to do X, but sometimes it takes a few steps to get to X, and you can end up just messing things up. And you really need to think about your team dynamic with her a lot harder than you would with a lot of other heroes, who you can just kind of put in any position and click a button and they do their job. She requires a lot of effort on that end. So maybe not a weakness of her per se, but definitely a difficulty that a lot of players are going to come across. The other thing is going to be that she is pretty low health. She is a high damage character, at least raw damage, but she doesn't have much health herself, which means that she's pretty susceptible to just getting hit down very quickly and then dying. She has no self-heals, so that is something that you need to be cautious of. You need somebody who can take care of her. And the other thing is just that she is got no dot damage. She has no damage over time at all. None of her paths give her any bleed or blight or burn or anything like that. She has raw physical damage. And the current state of the game definitely leans itself to raw damage not being as potent as damage over time. Damage over time is probably the best and most effective way to just deal a lot of damage to enemies. We've seen people getting ridiculous stacks of burn and blight And so in this case, that's definitely, I think, one of her weaknesses. And again, I don't know if it's as much a weakness as it is a change to the playstyle that we've kind of learned over this point in time to up until this DLC. She definitely has the potential to put out silly amounts of damage, and she is a very fun hero to play, but it is a difficult thing to set up all of that damage and to get it working. So yeah, she does have those weaknesses, and I definitely think that she's going to take some getting used to. I'm still getting used to her, and I've been playing her longer than 99% of the play base for this game, right? So it's definitely a bit difficult. All right, so over the last couple hours that I've been playing Sahar, there's definitely a couple things I've noticed about the best ways to play her. The first thing and the most important thing, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, is just you need to plan ahead with her. You have to have an idea of what it is you're looking to get out of her and how it is you're going to go about that. When you're sitting at the crossroads, definitely just take the time to look over her past, look over her abilities, and really build a team around her. I think that's one of the best things you can do with Sahar, is you can't just plop her into a team and just hope the team works out. You have to build a team around her specifically. She requires that level of effort. Might not be something that you enjoy, but if you take the time to do that, you can end up with one of the most fun teams that you've probably ever had just because of that. The other thing is to just be very dynamic with how you play her, in the sense that you may need to swap your play style, but she makes it very easy to do that. Like, oh, okay, I've gotten this trinket, or I've gotten, some buff, or something's come up on one of my other teammates and they're going to play a different play style. So really, every time you kind of have to swap your playstyle or your dynamic during the course of a run because of a trophy or a trinket or whatever the case is, definitely take the time to kind of look through her abilities and figure out, okay, how am I going to swap things up? Do I need to switch to a more defensive stance or an aggressive stance, or do I maybe need to swap some of her abilities out? Whatever the case may be, you definitely need to play around her. The other thing is definitely leaning into her passives on her stances. These are some of the most potent things about her. They are, once you have a stance applied, they are a passive. You get that buff. So there's a lot of really cool things you can get. Like I was even saying, she doesn't have a self-heal earlier. She does, in the form of her riposte on her Wanderer path, right? If you riposte on her Wanderer path and she's an aggressive, she can get a regen, which is a self-heal, right? So that can be a really potent thing for you to lean into, is like, well, if I don't want to worry about her dying so much, maybe I need to lean into her riposte more so that way I can get that regen, or whatever the case is. Her passives are one of the most potent things about her, and I think also one of the easiest things to forget when you're playing her. I know I found myself forgetting, and then something like a regen would pop up, or she'd get a stress reduction, or I'd notice she's taking a lot of damage, and I'd be like, what is happening? And I look down at the stance passives and I go, oh, right, that's something I need to keep in mind. So I think playing slow with her and just taking the time to figure out what you're doing is definitely a very important thing. She works really well on dancing teams. Obviously, she can move back and forth very easily. So if you have a team that is very fluid like that, and you like those kind of, jester, highwayman, runaway kind of teams that can move back and forth very easily, she's going to fit very well into those dynamics. And definitely take advantage of her buffs as well. I think a lot of people might lean straight into her like damage dealing abilities, which are very fun, but her buffs are pretty dang good, right? Her Again and her Ruthless Instruction abilities can line you up for some really interesting things, and definitely take advantage of those buffs because your heroes are going to really appreciate it. And yeah, I think that's really the biggest thing for her, is just the best way to play her is to just force yourself to play her in different ways. Try out all of her paths, try out all of her abilities. I think that's another thing, is just you have to click the button to figure out what it does. Reading it on paper and going through like this guide, it can be very like, okay, I think I get how that operates. But when you click it, it kind of gives you a better idea of like, okay, this is actually how it's going to work in the context of my team. I get the feeling Sahar is going to be dying a lot very early on as people figure her out, and that should be the way that it is because she's going to require a lot of effort. But once you figure her out, she's going to be an amazing asset for your team. So yeah, I think overall, she's one of the most fun heroes in the roster. I've absolutely adored having a hero that is as complex as she is. It requires a lot of effort, but I think that's That's a good thing, right? We've got the Crusader in this update as well, and he's probably one of the most simple heroes that you can have. So having the juxtaposition of a complex hero like this is a lot of fun. If you've been enjoying playing Sahar, let me know. Give me some ideas of combinations of abilities and things that you found in your playtime with her, and leave them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I make all sorts of Darkest Dungeon 2 content if you're interested in that. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you all in the next one.